Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today we continue our slow walk through the book of Revelation, and we've come to chapter 11. We're going to look at the first couple of verses in that chapter. Before we begin unpacking the details of Revelation 11, I want to do a quick review to set the context. Revelation begins with John in exile on the island of Patmos, suffering under Roman persecution along with his fellow Christians. He has a vision of Jesus, who gives John individual messages to each of the 7 churches, acknowledging their suffering, commending their faithfulness, and exhorting them to repent where necessary and to remain faithful through to the end. Then John is brought up into heaven, where he sees a scroll like the one the prophet Ezekiel ate to receive his calling and message. Unlike Ezekiel, John is not given the scroll right away because it is sealed. Before John can receive the scroll, he must first observe the preparations for judgment to be meted out on Rome. That's the breaking of the seals on the scroll, and the execution of those judgments, which is the blowing of the trumpets. This communicates to John and to the 7 churches that God is going to vindicate his faithful people and pour out his wrath on those who persecute them. In particular, he will pour out his wrath on Rome. The 6th trumpet unleashes a supernatural army so vast that it completely wipes out a third of those living on earth, which envisions the utter destruction of the Roman Empire. Destroying Rome, however, does not remove wickedness from the earth. There's more to the story. And after Rome is destroyed in the vision, John receives the scroll that he is supposed to eat, as Ezekiel had. That brings us to Revelation 11. Immediately after eating the scroll, John is given a taste of the bigger message he is to bring back from his vision, the message that transcends Rome or any individual empire, to the ultimate end of all human empires and all wickedness, along with the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. As Revelation 11 begins, John is given a measuring rod and told to measure the temple, while being warned that the holy city will be trampled for 42 months. Practically every word of the opening verses in Revelation 11 connects back to Ezekiel, back to Daniel, or forward to the description of a blasphemous beast king that will appear later in Revelation. Thank you for joining me as we dive into the treasures of Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. Chapter 11 is about the message that Christians need to have for the world that they live in. Right now, between the trumpets, between the 6th trumpet and the destruction of Rome, and the 7th trumpet and the final return of Christ, we have a message to give. The first part of that message is that we need to be mindful that we don't measure up to the holiness of God and are dependent upon the atonement in Christ. I think that's part of what the measuring means. The trampling of the temple for 42 months, I believe this is starting to connect to some details that will come out in more explicit manner in chapter 13. The first 2 verses of this chapter introduce several images, each one of which we need to look at in some detail in order to make sense of it and to lay the groundwork for the rest of chapter 11. At the end of the last lesson, I took us to Ezekiel. I pointed out how the part that follows Ezekiel's receiving his scroll and therefore his message was an important clue as to how we interpret what happens after John gets his scroll and his message. And I want to look at some specific verses from chapter 3 before zooming out a little bit and giving some overall comments about Ezekiel's call. Ezekiel 3:3 says, "And he said to me, Son of man, you must give your stomach this to eat, and you must fill your belly with this scroll that I'm giving you. And I ate, and it became like sweet honey in my mouth." 3:14 says, "And the Spirit lifted me and took me, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, and the hand of Yahweh was strong on me." 3:24 and 25 is some of the first details that Ezekiel gets about his call after having eaten the scroll. And the Spirit came into me, and it made me stand on my feet. And he spoke with me and said to me, "Come, shut yourself inside your house, and you, son of man, look, they will place cords on you, and they will tie you up with them. Then you will not go out into the midst of them." So here's the ironic imagery that Ezekiel receives a calling by eating the scroll, and then he is told that he is going to go back to his house and not talk to anybody, but get tied up inside so he can't even interact with people. The people have effectively done the same thing with their hearts by shutting him out of their hearing. He's just making that a reality by going into his house and being tied up. Every action that Ezekiel is given here at the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4 is a symbol of how God is going to interact with Israel in one level or another. To zoom out and kind of give an overall, because I'm not walking through Ezekiel in detail, I'm just referring to it as a kind of anticipation of what happens with John. But in Ezekiel's context, with his scroll and message, after Ezekiel receives the scroll and eats it, he's given instructions on how to enact in symbolic ways the message he's to deliver. In chapter 3, he's told to lock himself in a house as a symbol of God's refusal to give a message to those who will not listen. In chapter 4, he's told to make a small model of Jerusalem and then besiege it as a symbol of God's plan to punish the city for its unfaithfulness. Then he's told to mix grain with excrement and eat it to symbolize the unclean teaching that Israel's been receiving and the behaviors that are unclean in Israel. The point is that he's been given these symbolic actions to do as a way to deliver his message, which he received by eating the scroll. I believe that connects with John's experience, because in John's scroll and message, I believe that after John receives the scroll and eats it, he's given a parable that describes in symbolic ways the message he's to deliver, a message that will be told in more detail in chapters 12 to 22, the end of the book. This is not a common way to read Revelation chapter 11, but I believe the whole story of the two witnesses, which comes up here, which we'll look at next time, and this opening comment about measuring the temple, which we'll look at this time, are symbolic ways to communicate the message that John is to deliver. I think it's rather like a parable. And in that way, it's similar to Ezekiel, in that Ezekiel has these acted out parables, if you will, or acted out like object lessons. They're not exactly the same as what happens in Revelation 11, but they are communicating through symbolism. Revelation 11 is also communicating by symbolism. In fact, I want to back up and look at the last couple of verses in chapter 10, because I believe that that chapter division has created a kind of arbitrary separation between John eating his scroll and John getting the rest of the message that follows. These are intimately connected. You don't just start at the beginning of chapter 11 as if that's the beginning of the thought, because it's not. It's a continuation of the thought that starts with him taking the scroll. Let's look at Revelation chapter 10, starting in verse 10, and I'm going to read all the way through Revelation 11, verse 2. "And I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And I was told, 'You must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings.' And a measuring rod, similar in appearance to a staff, was given to me, saying, 'Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. And leave out the courtyard outside the temple, and do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Inside these two verses, there are many images. The first one I want to bring out is this comment about a measuring rod. John receives this measuring rod, and he's told to get up and measure the temple. But we're never told he actually does that. This measuring rod is never mentioned again after he receives it in this scene. This is the message he's supposed to take back. This is what he's supposed to do with the message when he gets back. And his first thing he needs to do is measure. That means that he's got to take stock of something when he gets back. I've pointed out that Ezekiel is a underlying pattern. And in many ways, John's experience echoes Ezekiel's pattern and in some ways departs from it. For example, the fact that John could not receive the scroll immediately the way Ezekiel did. So there's some parallel there in the fact that they have a scroll there they're supposed to eat, but they're different in that Ezekiel receives the scroll immediately in chapter 3, and John doesn't receive the scroll until Revelation 10. But there's some similarities and dissimilarities. Well, measuring the temple is actually a similarity because a measuring rod used to measure the temple is exactly mentioned from Ezekiel chapter 40. In Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 3, taken from the Septuagint, there's a mention of the exact same word as a measuring rod. And he led me there, and look, a man, and his appearance was like the appearance of glistening bronze, and in his hand there was a builder's cord and a measuring rod, and he stood by the gate. That's an angel that is going to measure the temple. So here, there's again some difference in that John is given the measuring rod and told to measure the temple himself. Ezekiel is never told to measure the temple. He observes this angelic man with the measuring rod do that while Ezekiel observes him, which is more parallel to what happens later on in the book of Revelation. And of course, we will get to that later. But here there is some difference. However, the whole idea of measuring the temple and using this measuring rod to do it is the parallelism from this image in Revelation 11:1 and Ezekiel chapter 40. There are multiple chapters devoted to the measuring of the temple in Ezekiel. John's vision doesn't track exactly with the measuring of the temple. Otherwise, it would be almost twice as long a book. He's told not just to measure the temple, but to measure the temple, the altar, and those who worship in it. This may point not just to this whole section from Ezekiel 40 on, where the temple's getting measured, but to an actual specific part of that section that mentions the temple, the altar, and those who are worshiping in it. That's Ezekiel chapter 43 and 44. The temple, the altar, and those who worship in it each represent something different about what is to be measured. Many commentators gloss over these three things and just talk about measuring the temple. Or they simply say that the idea of including those who worship in it means that the whole thing is a metaphor for measuring the people, which is getting to the idea of measuring their ethics, their behavior, their faithfulness, which I think is included, but I think is in fact somewhat distinct from measuring the temple and measuring the altar. I don't think it's incidental that three things are mentioned here, and each one has certain resonance. And the only way to appreciate the distinctions between these three is to go to Ezekiel, to the measuring of the temple then, and see what measuring the temple and the altar and the people who worship in it meant in Ezekiel, because I think it's meant to be a connection right here. So let's look at Ezekiel 43 and 44. I'm going to give some synopsis of what's in those passages. In chapter 43, the first 5 verses talk about the glory of God filling the visionary temple. He's already been measuring it all the way since chapter 40. And at the beginning of chapter 43, the glory of the Lord fills the temple. In 43, 6 through 12, then the temple, which has already been measured. So the measuring of the temple has already happened. But here it talks about why and what the temple message is about for delivering to the people. The temple embodies the holiness of God. The measurements of the temple should make the people ashamed of their sin. The measurements underscore that we are to be measured against the holiness of God, and we fail to measure up. But the measuring of the temple communicates to the people that they are not holy as God is holy. Because until you take the measure of it, you can't realize just how far off from that measure you are. Paul might say that's the point of the law as well, to show you just how far away from God's holiness we are. In chapter 43, verses 13 through 27, there's the measuring of the altar. And here, the altar is in fact measured in the context of these verses. It's the altar of sacrifice, not the altar of incense, which is inside the temple. And this is the altar outside the holy place where the animal sacrifices are made. This altar is measured. It is to represent the cost of atonement, which is underscored by reviewing the animal sacrifices that are made on it. We also need to take assessment of that atonement for our sin comes at a cost. And that cost was, of course, ultimately the cost of Christ's life, not of animal sacrifice. In Ezekiel, the focus is on the animal sacrifices. That's the only point of reference the Jews would have when Ezekiel is delivering his message. But now in John's message, the altar represents Christ's sacrifice, and subsequent to Christ's sacrifice, the altar also represents the sacrifice of Christians' lives for their testimony to Christ. Their sacrifice is not for atonement, but it's a cost of their faithfulness. And that sacrifice is also valued, highly valued. And that's part of the whole fifth seal in Revelation chapter 6. But that altar of sacrifice is measured here in Ezekiel in 43, 13 through 27. Then the next chapter begins, chapter 44. In chapter 44, 1 through 4, there's a mention of the gates of the temple, the fact that at the east gate, it's only open to the prince of the Lord. In verses 5 through 14, Israel is chided for allowing the uncircumcised of heart and flesh to serve in the temple and becoming a stumbling block of iniquity to the house of Israel. The negative measure of those who worship in the temple, these are the people who ought not to have been because of their uncircumcised heart and flesh. In verses 15 through 31 of chapter 44, then is the positive case for those who do belong in the temple, the people who, quote, kept the charge of my sanctuary when the people of Israel went astray from me, end quote. These are elevated as those who worship as priests before the Lord in the visionary temple. Altogether, I believe that this is the section being alluded to in Revelation 11:1. The temple embodying the holiness of God, the altar embodying the cost of atonement, and those who worship being those who are found faithful, who measure up, if you will, in their faithfulness, in their loyalty. Obviously, Christ's faithfulness is the only one perfect enough to make atonement. That's why it's such a high cost. But those who worship are those who remain loyal to Christ, even when others go astray. So that brings us back to Revelation 11 and the fact that John is given this measuring rod and told to measure the temple, the altar, and those who worship in it, something which he does not do in its immediate context. But it makes sense for him not to do it right then and there, because this is about his message that he's supposed to deliver to the peoples of all the nations. I believe his message to the people of the nations is divided into two broad categories. One, a message for the faithful, and then a message primarily for the unfaithful. And in this case, this is a message for the faithful. So he is going to do this measuring when he gets back to the preaching and proclamation to the people. And that message is about measuring to the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship it. I can reinforce this idea that the idea of measuring is not just about physically measuring a space, but about a metaphorical measuring of behavior by looking at the use of the word measure in other contexts in the New Testament. Look at Matthew 7, verses 1 and 2, part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For by what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and by what measure you measure out, it will be measured out to you." This is the exact same word used as a command to John to measure the temple, but it is here used to measure behavior. This section is not about avoiding judging altogether. It's about realizing that by whatever measure or judgment you use about others, you yourself will be judged and measured. It's also used in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 12 and 13. For we do not dare to classify or to compare ourselves with some who commend themselves, but they themselves, when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, do not understand. But we will not boast beyond limits, but according to the measure of the assignment that God has assigned to us as a measure to reach even as far as you. There's a lot of measure themselves by themselves, compare themselves with themselves. This gets a little bit to the point of Revelation 11:1. We're not supposed to measure ourselves by ourselves because we always measure up then. Even if I measure myself against other people who I know I measure up favorably against, that's not right either. Where the measurement counts is when I measure against the holiness of God. Then I recognize that I don't measure up. Then I recognize that I need that atonement. The function of the altar is necessary. Christ has completed that function, but I need it. I need atonement from Christ. So the measure of the temple, the measure of the altar, and the measure of the people are all necessary. Then we can understand where we fit. Understand first that we do not measure up, and then understand second that Christ has made atonement for us. And so we can be grateful for that we have forgiveness despite our fault and not measuring up to his standard. John is to continue what Jesus started in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation. Chapters 2 and 3 in Revelation are Christ's measure of those 7 churches. In some ways, they get lauded. In some ways, they get critiqued, but they are measured. John is supposed to carry this forward with him when he returns from Patmos to deliver his prophecy, his message to the people. Revelation 11:2. Leave out the courtyard outside the temple. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. In Ezekiel, just to close the loop back with that, the outer courtyard is where the measurement starts back in Ezekiel chapter 40. The measurements tend to go from the outside toward the middle in Ezekiel. So the outer courtyard is the first thing measured in Ezekiel 40, and here in Revelation, it's not to be measured at all. Why would it not be measured at all? I think it's because the Gentiles, which here I'm taking as a synonym for non-believers, those who are not believers in Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 13, we see an explanation for why we may not need to measure the court that's been given to the Gentiles. In 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 13, Paul says this: I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. In the context of 1 Corinthians, there are a lot of connections to what's going on around this. I don't want to get into church discipline, which this touches on here in 1 Corinthians, or some of the other aspects. The main point I want to hit is that which I've highlighted in yellow, which is that Paul says it's not our job to judge people who are outside the church. We do need to measure the people inside the church. That's part of what this passage is about in 1 Corinthians. You do need to measure those who are called brothers. But those who are outside the church, we don't have any responsibility for judging them. In other words, measuring the outer court of Gentiles. God judges them, not us. What about the comment that the Gentiles are going to trample the holy city? I would probably not have picked up on an echo of the Olivet Discourse if I had not been studying carefully through the Olivet Discourse fairly recently. Luke's rendition of the discourse specifically mentions the Gentiles trampling Jerusalem, which would be what the holy city could be read as. If it is not a literal reference to Jerusalem, but to a metaphorical symbol that Jerusalem may stand for example, it could stand for people of faith. But even if it does, it is at least metaphorically referencing the city of Jerusalem. And so therefore it is an echo of Luke chapter 21, verse 24. I'm going to go back and read Luke 21, verses 20 through 24, because I believe the context is important. Also, how I interpret this part of the Olivet Discourse has bearing on how we're going to unfold parts of Revelation, not just here in Revelation 11, but in 12 and 13 and 14 as well. So let's go back to Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth, and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. My take on this section about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and its desolation, and the idea of the women who are pregnant and nursing infants and being in particular distress, is that this is a section referring to the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in AD 70. For the full explanation, you may want to go back and watch my videos on the Olivet Discourse. At the end, he says, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. I believe that began, the trampling of Jerusalem began with the fall of Jerusalem, and then even more so with the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem, which happened after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The Romans literally kicked every Jew out of Jerusalem. They completely Hellenized or Romanized the city of Jerusalem. They renamed it. They leveled the temple, what was left of the ashes of the temple, and they built a temple to Jupiter. They populated the whole city with Gentiles, with Romans, who had no affiliation to Judaism. That, to me, was the fulfillment of Jesus' words here, that they would be led captive among all the nations. In other words, they were kicked out of Jerusalem. And that was an exile similar to the exile that they had experienced back under Babylon. At that point, I believe Jerusalem is being trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. And that the time of the Gentiles continues until Christ's second coming. I believe the second coming of Christ ends the time of the Gentiles. I think the point of the Olivet Discourse is that what happens after the temple has been desecrated is not that the temple comes back. What happens is that Jesus comes back. And then we have the ultimate perfection and eradication of the evil that is desecrated. Look at Revelation 11:2. They will trample the holy city for 42 months, he says. This is not the literal temple, because we're talking about the holiness of God is what that temple represents. The temple in the parable of measuring the temple is about measuring up to the holiness of God. So the temple isn't literally the temple. The courtyard isn't literally the courtyard. It's about not judging Gentiles because they're outside of the covenant that Christ has made with the people. So we're not measuring them. I'm reading this as symbolic imagery, and it does connect to Daniel. The 42 months can come from nowhere else. 3.5 years is 42 months. And there is no other place where 3.5 years is so prominent as in the book of Daniel. Daniel mentions some variation of 3.5 years in every vision in the second half of the book. In chapter 7, in chapter 8, in chapter 9, and in chapter 12. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 are all one extended vision. In chapter 7, verse 25, He says that the holy ones of the Most High will be given into his hand. That's a rebellious king, into this rebellious king's hand for a time and 2 times and half a time. That's generally understood that each one of those references to time is a year. So it's a year, 2 years, and half a year, 3.5 years. In Daniel 8:13 and 14, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. The question is, how long will the sanctuary and the host be trampled underfoot? And the answer is 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, this references the morning and evening sacrifices. And most interpreters would say that that's counting twice per day, one for the morning and one for the evening. So we actually divide 2,300 by 2 to come up with the actual number of days. So 1,150 would be the number of days, which is roughly 3.5 years. The temple was unusable for 3.5 years because of Antiochus' desecration. So there's the 3.5 years appearing in chapter 8. During this 3.5 years, the sanctuary will be trampled. The wording is so very close to what we have in Revelation 11, verse 2. The reason I think that most commentators don't make more out of this connection of the sanctuary being trampled in 3.5 years is because chapter 8 is quite explicitly about Antiochus IV. It's not as clear in chapter 9, nor is it as clear in either chapter 7 or chapter 12. Only in chapter 8 is it relatively crystal clear that what we're talking about is Antiochus IV's desecration of the temple. And so his trampling underfoot of the sanctuary and the host is not made as much of a connection to Revelation because people are trying to make it out that Daniel is talking about the exact same thing as what's being described in Revelation. Not that he's talking about Antiochus, which is a symbol or is being used as a symbol for what happens in Revelation, but literally about what happens in Revelation, Daniel is talking about. I don't think that's the case. I think Daniel is talking about Antiochus, and Antiochus becomes a symbol for what happens in Revelation. So it's a connection, and by analogy, not saying that Daniel is actually talking about the end times that's described in Revelation. Daniel's talking about Antiochus. Antiochus is a symbol of what happens in Revelation. I have come to a position that almost all prophecy is about analogy, that something in the past is analogous to what's going to happen in the future. There's a whole realm of theology called typology. Typology is about types and antitypes. The types are the symbols from the Old Testament, and the antitypes are the fulfillment in the New. And they are analogous to one another, but not exactly identical. I believe that Antiochus IV's desecration of the temple and the 3.5 years that he left it there, desecrated and unusable until it could be rededicated after 3.5 years, is a type of what will happen at the end before the final judgment. It is a type, and the antitype we'll see unfolded in more detail in chapters 13 and 14, and which we will see anticipated somewhat here in chapter 11 when we get more into the 2 witnesses. And so the symbology of the trampling of the sanctuary still applies. Yes, it happened under Antiochus IV, and that's what Daniel is primarily talking about. Jesus is picking up on that idea in the Olivet Discourse when he talks about the Gentiles trampling the city of Jerusalem. John is picking up that same imagery and talking about the holy city getting trampled as well. Not that Daniel was talking about this, but that it applies by analogy to what's going to happen with the city. In chapter 9, there's the half of a week. Let me read chapter 9, verse 27. He will make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week, but in half of the week he will let cease sacrifice and offering, and in its place a desolating abomination comes, even until the determined complete destruction is poured out on the desolator. This is where I read Antiochus IV as the he who makes a strong covenant with the many for 1 week. The first half of that week, things may be a little rocky because Antiochus isn't exactly sympathetic to the Jews, but they're fairly stable. The temple is certainly usable. Regular offerings are happening for those first half a week of Antiochus's reign. And then halfway in to this last 7 years, he ends the sacrifices by desecrating the temple, setting up his own altar to Zeus on top of the regular altar of sacrifice, rendering the altar of sacrifice unusable. And for 3.5 years, Antiochus insists on his Hellenized worship at the temple. That is the ceasing of the sacrifice. It is then another 3.5 years, and then the temple can be rededicated and be used again for its intended purpose to worship Yahweh and for sacrifices for atonement. We're going to run into 42 months or some variation on 3.5 years in chapter 12, and I just pointed out that it's in chapter 13. It is symbolic of transitions. I think it's specifically symbolic of that transition from a time when things are okay, but not great, to a time when things are terrible, and the transition from when times are terrible to the time that they will be completely resolved and made perfect. And all of that traces back to the way it's used in Daniel. But I don't think Daniel's talking about end time. Everything that's happened has happened before. When it happens at the end, that will be the last iteration of a pattern that has repeated itself more than once before the end. In chapter 12 of Daniel, 1,290 days, which notice is not exactly 1,150 days, which is what you would get if you do the calculation in chapter 8. And in fact, in chapter 12, there are 2 different numbers of days. They are all roughly 3.5 years, but not any of them exactly identical when it comes to that level of detail. I think we need to appreciate the fact that these images are meant to be relative and abstract, not precise. All right, the 42 months. This is not the only time in the book of Revelation we're going to run across 42 months. I want to come to the next reference to it, which is in chapter 13. But in Revelation 13:5, we read, "The beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months." Let me just go ahead and continue because verses 6 and 7 are also relevant to how I'm reading what we have all the way back in Revelation 11. In Revelation 13:6 and 7 says, "It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation." So we have this beast in Revelation 13 who is allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. He's actually allowed to be the winner at times over the saints. Revelation chapter 11 is all of this parable that's going to be elaborated on in Revelations 12 through 22. He may begin some of the details of this connection to the later chapters right there in that reference to trampling the holy city for 42 months. So the city of Jerusalem, the literal city of Jerusalem, is already being trampled by the Gentiles while John is having this revelation. But I think this parable that he's being given in chapter 11 is a message that there will be a more severe time of suffering, not for the literal city of Jerusalem, but for the people of God. Just as the temple and the altar and the people who worship in it are symbols, I think this mention of the holy city is a symbol in a parable for the faithful people of God. Their being trampled for 42 months is the parable's way of saying the same thing as Revelation 13:5, 6, and 7, that there will be a time when there will be a ruthless leader, this beast, who for 42 months is going to make war on the saints and to conquer them, i.e., to trample them. I am going to connect these things quite closely and say that Revelation 13:5 through 7 is the working out of Revelation 11:2, the trampling of the holy city for 42 months. I also will, as we get into the rest of Revelation 11, be making connections between the two witnesses and what happens with the beast in Revelation 13, 14, 15. As I said at the top, after John receives the scroll and eats it, he's given a parable that describes in symbolic ways the message he's to deliver, a message that will be told again in more detail in chapters 12 to 22, mainly chapters 13 through 22. 12 is another transition. But this is the idea that what we read in chapter 11 anticipates things we're going to see again in these later chapters. That 42 months and the trampling is the first time we see a connection to something that's going to be described in more detail. Chapter 11, we have a symbolic reference to this holy city getting trampled by the Gentiles. In chapter 13, we have a slightly more concrete reference to a beast persecuting Christians and elaborating on that a bit more with his blasphemous words and so on. But I believe those connect. It's a little more abstract and symbolic in chapter 11. Even in chapter 13, it's symbolic because I don't think it's a literal beast. I think it's a person, not a animalistic creature that literally rises out of the sea and is doing these things. I think we have to read these things as symbolic. Even the most literal premillennial interpretation sees that beast as representing a person they would call the Antichrist. So that's still symbolic when it says that the beast has a blasphemous name on his head. But it's a little slightly more unpacked and detailed in 13 than in 11. I'll explain a little bit more about why I think that next time, because we walk through the rest of the story of the two witnesses. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. The message for John continues in chapter 11 with the introduction of two witnesses who are the subject of much speculation as to their identities and how they fit into the overall eschatology of Scripture. That will be the subject of our next lesson, which will continue unpacking my understanding of these images as a kind of parable encapsulating the more detailed narratives of Revelation, specifically Revelations 13 through 20. I look forward to studying Revelation again and examining the treasures in the biblical text. Until then, may the Lord be with you.